Let's go back to the beginning, the very start. You're a reservist in the early 90s. Why did you volunteer to go overseas?
Well, I guess it was the opportunity. When you're in your early 20s with few attachments, it's a bit of, it's a bit of a different decision cycle, so to speak, when you're in your 40s with a family. At the time, I was in university, and I wasn't really enjoying myself. I'd kind of gone there mostly out of family expectations more than anything else, and it wasn't what I expected. And this was kind of something that came along that excited me. And again, it was a chance to use some of my training, I thought. And like I said, I was kind of disillusioned with my university experience. So it's kind of the timing worked as much as anything else.
How much experience in the military did you have at that point?
Well, our training, I could say our tour training in earnest started at unit level in the fall of '93. So by then I'd had just under 3.5 years in the regiment at that time. So I'd done a couple of extra courses over and above my initial recruit level and trade course. So I had a bit of experience, I guess. I mean, it's just normal for a private or a brand new corporal to have back then, or in general, I guess. And so, like I said, I had some courses, but not a lot of experience outside of courses. And as well, I had done a few enemy force things in Wainwright in the summer, as well as just unit training.
So what were you hoping to get out of the experience?
Really, I just thought it was an opportunity to get some more experience, to get a chance to work with different units, to leave the country as well. I knew that from talking to other people that had been on other tours that if you basically as well, when you get your leave, you're already being in Europe, it might be a bit easier to do some traveling or see something as well. So I mean, like I said, it was as much as I wasn't necessarily hoping for anything specific. It was just a chance to do something different in someplace else, hopefully. So
at the time, what did you know about the situation in Bosnia?
Well, it was all over CNN at the time, and I thought the coverage was actually very biased against one of the factions. Not that they didn't deserve the type of coverage they were getting, but they really, once I arrived there, I realized that they really overlooked the contributions, so to speak, to the atrocities of two of the other sides that were there. I've always been a bit of history buff, so I knew that Sarajevo was where Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, which was kind of the pivotal event that led to the start of the First World War, and and then as you go through it, you kind of realize kind of the inexplicable nature, I guess, of Balkan nationalist politics that kind of carried on from that instance up until their civil war that they had in the '90s. So.
Because it was all over the news at the time, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. But like I said, I mean, my perception is that a lot of it was just, a lot of the coverage was basically reporters, reporters in Sarajevo getting briefings from the defenders of Sarajevo and not really leaving Sarajevo to see what was going on in the rest of the country. So it's basically go to a press conference, file your story, go back to the hotel bar. That seemed to be kind of the standard of what I thought the standard of journalism was at the time.
So very much from the Muslim perspective.
Oh, very much so. And I mean, a case in point is once I got there, there was a British unit that was co-located with, actually later on in the tour, we shared a location with a British unit, and I've actually maintained my friendships with some of those guys in the intervening years. And their mortar platoon had a counter battery radar set in one of their Land Rovers, and when they were going through Sarajevo, they were able to track some of the incoming fire to basically another Muslim area. Like they were traveling through a Bosnian area, and there happened to be a camera crew there, so there were some mortar rounds, and they did their drills, and with their counter battery radar, they realized the fire was coming through basically within that same area. So either some really slick Serbian special forces team had set up a mortar in broad daylight and got it out of there, or else these were essentially the Bosnians were shelling their own people for the benefit of CNN and the BBC. which I think is a very similar conclusion to what Lewis Mackenzie, former Canadian Force Commander, concluded in his book as well. So, as well as Michael Rose, the Force Commander, and our British Army Force Commander, through the first half of my tour, concluded much the same thing. So,
just to finish off with sort of what you're doing in Canada. How old were you at the time that you volunteered?
So I would have been 21 years old when the like I said, when the unit training first started. By the time we left, I was 22.
So what did your family and friends think of your decision at the time?
Well, I know that at the time my family, it took almost, by the time I'd left, I'd been in it was my 4th year in the military, and it almost took that long for my immediate family to kind of come to terms with the fact that this is what I wanted to do. And I think my extended family was kind of wondering if I was, crazy. Some of the remarks that they were saying and stuff like that at the time weren't necessarily to their credit. And I guess if I'd have been, I suppose if I'd have been less forgiving, I wouldn't be talking to them anymore. But I mean, they just didn't really understand what they were saying completely. So,
what kinds of things were they saying?
Well, one of my aunts actually says, "What are you trying to do? Go out and get killed," or something like that. And basically, I think what happened necessarily is my father, I think, stepped in and just basically said, like, you people can either support him or you're dead to me. And so I think that kind of smartened a few people up, at least to the point where they weren't saying stuff where they thought I could hear. But I guess that's what, in some ways, I mean, these are people that grew up in, a peaceful country that, had never, basically it was their much older father or grandparents that had fought in wars, not one of their contemporaries, or had gone to a war zone and stuff. So it really wasn't part of their mindset at the time. So, I mean, as it happened, when I got back, we were in the middle of an NHL lockup, and so I nearly got into a fight with one of my uncles because he was complaining about, having to watch junior hockey. And I wasn't very understanding of his position, and, anyway, it wasn't worth it to go any further than that. But
so you volunteer. Who are you going off with, and what kind of pre-training do you do?
Well, the way it worked was you volunteered, and then they would get a position for you. So initially, my position was to be a rifleman / communicator, because I had the basic infantry communicator course to go with B Company of 1 PPCLI, and then. But what I realized when you got there was that you had to compete with your position. So my recollection is that there was probably an extra 50 or 60 people on the ground over than what they had originally, over than what they needed. And so eventually I went over, I was taken on as a rifleman within 6th Platoon of B Company. And that company was attached out of that battalion as part of a battle group headed by the Lord Strathcona's Horse. So the battalion itself went to Croatia about a month before we left, they would have left in April of 1994. We left Calgary in May of 1994, and we went to Bosnia. So there were 2 Canadian battle groups in theater at the time. We were in what was known as Canbat 2, working out of our headquartered in a town called Visoko, which is less than 30 kilometers outside of Sarajevo.
So as part of this competing for a position, what sorts of things were you judged on?
Well, I think a lot of it was physical fitness, attitude, acumen with weapons and things like that. So I think they had brought extra people along if people got hurt. And again, my perception at the time, that's my perception as a private. They might have had other things going on as well, but essentially within a month I was in the company and training alongside them.
How actually competitive was it between reservists doing this?
Well, that I can't really remember. I mean, I just know that they basically ran. It reminded me almost of a repetition of our infantry course in some ways, because we'd go out and we had ranges for all the different weapons, the gas hut, a lot of route marching. So basically, for a lot of guys, if they kept falling out of route marches and runs, then they were done. We had a day out in the training area doing several days actually doing section attacks and other things. So I think they were also assessing the quality of some of the reserve NCOs as well. So as a private, it wasn't as competitive, but it was definitely like they fired more than a few reserve NCOs. They had extras of those, so they were able to kind of cherry pick the ones that they thought would be the most suited for what they needed. It's a pretty steep pyramid. So.
What was it like at that time as a reservist going into to augment a regular force unit?
Well, that was interesting because, like all organizations, you encountered various levels of maturity. And so, for the most part, it was like if you could prove that you were competent, then they would take you in. And there was always a few mouthpieces around, and I guess I've been lucky. I've been a bit bigger than everybody else, so I probably didn't get it as bad as other people did. But for the most part, I was treated quite well. I mean, it was. I think that battalion at the time was under strength, so I think in many ways they were glad for the manpower boost, if for no other reason than they actually would have more people to do, to act as duty drivers and things like that in the short term. But like I said, once we had done our training and you basically proved that you were competent, then they actually looked after you. This is basically like, we might have a problem, the adage that, we might have a problem with you, but you're ours and nobody can say anything bad about you. That's basically what I encountered. So, like I said, the NCOs are really good at that, and as was our company commander and sergeant major.
You did some pre-training in the States, right?
Yes, we did.
Where did you go, and what was the emphasis on?
Well, we went to Camp Pendleton, which, if you don't know what that looks like, you just have to watch Heartbreak Ridge, the movie Heartbreak Ridge with Clint Eastwood in it. We did a lot more ranges, and a lot of, I guess, scenario training, for lack of a better term. Where what we were practicing initially was convoy escorts, because the people that we were relieving were doing convoy escorts in and out of Sarajevo. And then what happened was the Bosnians and the Croatians signed a peace treaty, so that a three-sided civil war came to a two-sided civil war with one side not trusting each other. So all of a sudden we didn't have to do convoy escorts anymore. Instead, we did treaty verification. So if anything, I mean, this is all in good faith. I mean, our pre-training, I guess, was misdirected, but it was based on the information that they had. And pretty much right before we deployed, they had to scramble to kind of figure out what it is we were going to do. But I think the quality of that unit at the time and the people in it, they were able to go with that change pretty quickly.
So looking back at it, knowing what you did on the tour itself, in summary, how adequate do you think your pre-training was?
Well, the ranges were apt, and there was some of the idea that you're training with rules of engagement and things like that. That was relevant, obviously. Convoy escorts went out the window just before we got there. So, and again, it's not, they were training with the knowledge that they had. They didn't know that, they didn't know 2 months before we left that things would change basically pretty much while everybody was in deployment leave. So, I would say much of it wasn't, but that wasn't the fault of the people running it. It just, things on the ground changed. But I think, like I said, the quality of the people and the quality of the level of training that we normally have in the CF was able to deal with that change.
Is there anything else that you want to say about the lead up to the getting to Bosnia?
No, it was, except that I was in Calgary for 4 months at Curry Barracks, and then they had about 2.5 months of training here in Edmonton for the Edmonton area people that went over. So in some ways I was actually training for almost as long or longer than I was overseas. So and some of it was repetitive and some of it was low-level stuff, but I guess that's not uncommon. So,
based on your training, what you were seeing on television, CNN, what was your expectation as to what you were getting into?
I didn't know what to think, because at that time the Serbs were taking hostages as well. So they would basically roll up to a location with overwhelming force and disarm the people there, and then basically tie them or chain them to a high-value target and dare NATO to bomb it. So we didn't know what to expect. That was one of our primary concerns, and there was talk about like, what do you do? And a lot of people were like, well, what do you do when an armored company rolls up on your lightly armored section? Like, and that was thankfully something we never had to deal with.
And what were your first impressions when you flew in?
Actually, it's kind of funny. I have some relatives that are oil men that have spent some time in the Middle East. So one of them was telling me about dealing with Muslims and how to conduct yourself. And so the first Muslim area I'm driving through, there's a guy roasting a pig on a spit and drinking it out of the neck of a brandy bottle. So I'm kind of like, well, thanks, thanks guys. That was a waste of everybody's time. I mean, so it was kind of a through the looking glass experience. And in some ways, the other devastation was a very rude shock as well. So if you can imagine like a small village of brick buildings in the same kind of terrain that you'd find in interior BC, and basically there's nothing above the first story of the building. It's just been blasted apart. That was a shock. Obviously, the smell of what I realized later was probably decomposition in a lot of cases as well, was something that that I learned to recognize after the fact. And I guess just basically inhumanity, which, but like I said, the biggest thing initially was just devastation.
Yeah, I'm assuming you flew into Sarajevo.
No, we actually flew into Split, which is on the Croatian coast, and then we drove in from there. And the reason that is because the intermittent nature of Sarajevo Airport at the time. It was always being shot at or shelled, and it wasn't considered a dependable location or a consistent place to get people and supplies in and out of anymore.
So what was it like? Can you just describe your own camp in Visoko? How was it set up?
Well, it was it had been an industrial site, and so at a factory. So it was walled off. We had guard towers. I'm not sure how defensible the camp would have been, but it kind of kept casual riffraff out, I guess. Our company was based in, I think, the top or the second from the top floor of an old factory. So we had modular tents set up inside of what would have been probably a big bay in the top floor. But I wasn't there for that much of the time I was there. We were on the line, and then we later moved our location for the last third of the tour.
So once you pushed out to start doing your day job there,
yes.
What was that like?
Well, initially we were put into what they called an observation post, so an OP. So it was basically a vantage point that was built on top of, or I wouldn't say not necessarily on top of a high feature, but high enough in the mountains that we could look at a valley below us. And essentially what we were living in was basically a burnt out house with enough of a pad that we could park our carrier, and they had a small sandbag and wooden structure that acted as the actual observation post as well. So there was a wire that they had strung from the OP to the carrier so we could use the carrier's radio. And there was a C6 general purpose machine gun in the OP as well.
It sounds pretty austere.
Yes.
And this is just your section?
Yes, it was just a section. So our platoon had 3 sections scattered in 3 OPs initially, and then sometimes they'd have us in roadside checkpoints as well. And our job at the time was treaty verification.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
The job itself was, like I mentioned before, treaty verification. So we were there to just observe and report if we saw any troop movements or what looked like troop movements, like I said, because we were in an area that the Croatians through which actually what had been a bitterly contested area between the Croatians and the Bosnian government, to the point where the Bosnians had actually, the intel that we got was that the Bosnians had used Afghanis, so Afghan war veterans, as shock troops in that area, and there was Arabic graffiti on some of the buildings that we saw. So that led some credence into that. So, like I said, we were in this we were overlooking one side of a valley, through which I guess if one side or another wanted to shore up their position, they'd have to move troops. So we were there to mostly observe and report if we saw anything to that effect.
What sorts of things did you see? Anything stick in your mind?
Well, there was basically another Croatian section next to us, who spent most of their time drunk. Once we started walking around the area, there was pretty much a universal mine threat, so we couldn't really go exploring, so to speak. the thing that always struck me was the house that we were in was on the edge of a village, and there was all these shoes outside the door. And what we figured out was the locals always took their shoes off before going in, so this village had actually been hit at night. Because, like I said, the whole village had been burnt out, but there was all these shoes of all sizes neatly arranged outside the door. So, I mean, to this day, I don't know how many of them actually got out. But
That's a very eerie kind of image.
it is, and like I said, when you kind of after the fact, you realize what was smelling so bad. So, like I said, we were basically living on the edge of it at the Cleanse village for about 2 months. Our presence there was actually welcomed by the people in that area, because I don't know if we could actually really guarantee their security, but they felt safer with us there. So once we did start walking around, we'd actually walk down the hill, and we were to the point where we'd almost have to do clover leafs in and out of people's houses. They were inviting us in for refreshments all the time. It would have been a great insult to turn them down, so we actually had what we called our designated drunk, because they're a very macho culture, and so we'd have one guy whose job it was just to basically like drink what was offered to us, and so the rest of us could actually look around properly. Yeah, so like I said, it was you could see it was ordinary people just being caught up in this, and apparently there had been a sniper problem just before we got there, and I guess coincidental with our staying there, it moved on or disappeared. So I think for that problem alone, the locals were kind of glad that we were there.
What was it like living, eating, working so closely with, I'm assuming it's a 10-man section, 8-man section?
You mean, yeah. Well, I mean, it's like living with really annoying roommates that you can do nothing about. Like, it's not like you're saying, I've had it, I'm going to find no new roommates. It doesn't work like that. Plus, there's 2 people in your section that have rank. So actually, for the most part, it really wasn't too bad, but you kind of had to learn with people's idiosyncrasies and things like that. So like if somebody snored and kept the other 8 guys awake, then, which I was that guy, so basically they knew that they could throw a boot at me and I'd roll over, that kind of thing. And, it's just getting used to that. The biggest thing, we had this unwritten rule, like, so again, I'm dating myself, obviously, but we had a ghetto blaster in our section. So in order to avoid real fights that would start, the unwritten rule was you at least had to let the tape that was running finish its side. So I'm not a very big country music fan, especially like the drippy, drawn out, my wife left me and on the way out she shot the dog country music there. I'd have to endure a whole side of that before I could put in the type of music I wanted. So, we didn't. Like I said, it was a compromise, and sometimes, we were well led, and we kind of had to, we figured out the best way so we wouldn't just rip our throats over small things like that. But it's a lot of small things that you have to learn how to deal with. We had also found a couple of dogs, puppies, that in a burnt out car as well. So we had adopted a couple of dogs as pets, and I think that kind of kept things alive and were a bit more upbeat than kind of a distraction there as well. So,
was there a day, couple of days that are more memorable for you on this deployment?
Yes. In the early part, I guess boredom's a terrible thing, and we had a bit of a rat problem, so we had some bright ideas about how to deal with our rats, and which led to probably some really close shaves. I'm not really prepared to go into that because the individuals concerned are all still alive and some are still serving, but I just say boredom's a terrible thing. So that's kind of the funny thing that I can remember off that. On one of our walkarounds, there was myself and 2 other guys that were, like I said, we walked down the hill that we were at just to do kind of a bit of a clearing patrol a bit. And just as we coincidental with our getting down there, one of the buildings was basically a family got burnt out of their home. So it was, what had happened was in that area, you didn't want to have a nice looking house because it would attract the wrong kind of attention, but it was obvious that a family was trying to move back into their old house. And we had seen them from our OP earlier that day, and they'd been playing fetch with the dog in this field. So what they were doing was actually using the dog to clear anti-purse mines. to try and verify that their field was clear of any personnel mines. So they're using the dog, and they'd kind of throw the stick out, and then they would walk out and then throw the stick out, so the dog conceivably would trip any more mines before they brought their ox on it or the rest of them. So once they'd been there, somebody from the Croatian side actually came down and burnt the house down. And later found out he was actually a policeman, so he's a member of the Croatian police. And it's hard not to look at them as, in some ways, like they were basically a glorified death squad in a lot of ways, and very corrupt. But the individual in question, I caught the movement out of my eye. Like, we were worried that there was somebody in there, so kind of being very restrained. We kind of followed the hard pack because we were worried about mines, to the fact that we weren't walking off of concrete very much. So we took a calculated risk to kind of look around to try and do the best we could to make sure there was nobody actually left in this building. And the heat was too much that we wouldn't have got in there anyway. But we didn't see anything or hear anybody, so we backed off. And just as we backed off, I saw some movement, and I brought my rifle up, and it was this guy on a bicycle. And it was actually the first 6 months that we'd been issued the Alcan sight. So looking at him through basically just under 4 power magnification, had I wanted to shoot him, I could basically just at that range, no deflection with him riding away, he wasn't going to outrun the bullet, and I could just about pick the organ that I wanted to shoot at that range. And because he didn't have a weapon and he was fleeing away from me, he was kind of beneath the criteria for rules of engagement. So this is a guy that I'm convinced was the guy that burned that family out of their house. And it's one of those things that you kind of wonder what the consequences were. Like, if I'd have shot him, I probably would have made the world a better place, but there's a good chance I would have gone to jail over it, or had to, lie about it to people about, what really happened. So that's kind of some of the things that stay with you, not to mention, the adrenaline and everything else that goes through you when you're about to shoot somebody. Like, I physically stopping myself from shooting him was actually one of the hardest things I've ever done. I've often compared the feeling to lust. It's not quite there, but it's the only thing that comes close when I actually had that sight picture. And the only thing that comes close is saying, from not shooting him, it's comparable to, having the woman of your dreams in bed beside you and you rolling over and reading a book. That's about the closest thing I can think of to what it took for me to not drill this guy, and basically not put a bullet right in the bottom of his skull, because at that range it would have been no problem at all. And I'm convinced I would have made the world a better place, but like I said, because of what was happening with the fallout from the Somalia scandal, that we had been basically cowed into not taking risks with interpreting rules of engagement. So he got to ride away.
Those rules. I want to make sure I'm clear. Mm-hmm. Did you ever see that family again?
Oh yes, yeah. They actually, the father actually told me the guy's name. So this guy had probably been in that area or grew up in that area, and apparently, or he had been a policeman or something like that. Like, the guy actually wrote down his name in my FMP. And by sheer coincidence, we had some United Nations military observers drive through. This is all just coincidence. This wasn't planned. They drove up, and I passed the information to them. The one officer was a British guy, and the other one was a Kenyan. And like I said, they were glad that we were there, and they weren't confident that they could do anything with the information, but they still took it. So that's where it ended there, as far as I know.
So family lost their home, but they kept their lives?
Yes.
At that time?
Yes.
Okay. What was it like just in general, working under those rules of engagement that you referred to?
For a lot of people, it was frustrating because they were very convoluted. Like, for example, someone running towards you with a grenade in his hand wasn't a threat worthy enough of engaging until he was throwing the grenade. As soon as the grenade left his hand, he was not a threat anymore. And especially, not to mention, as soon as he turned around and ran away from his throw, he was not a threat anymore. So that sums up the rules of engagement right there, in my mind.
And what about just the general effect on someone as a soldier over a 6-month period where you're caught in the middle?
Well, there was a certain amount of powerlessness. I mean, we had people that had been in, actually we were joined by partway through the tour by people that had been in that area before who had actually witnessed a lot more real atrocities than we had. That were, I think, one of the things that contributed to trauma in some people was the fact that they were helpless. These were rules of engagement that the United Nations came up for us. These weren't the CF's rules of engagement, but they were part of the mission. So, I have no doubt that they sounded good in an office in a building in New York, but on the ground, like I said, they could be impractical to the point of being ludicrously dangerous. Again, that was, in my mind, that was about the only time the rules of engagement really frustrated me. I mean, any other incident I'm familiar with, it was very obvious, and people return, the incidents that I'm familiar with, people actually returned fire. It was overwhelmingly cases of firing back, or there was within our mandate where we were protecting refugees and people were trying to shoot at the refugees. So, like I said, that was the only time it was frustrating for me, but I just said, like I said, the ludicrous nature of, a man throwing a grenade at you and how you could go to jail at different points in that instance, sums up how the rules of engagement were for things in that juncture. So,
What about some of the belligerents in this case? Lobbing mortars at you, firing machine guns at you and your fellow soldiers. How often would that sort of thing?
It was very rare for us. Like I said, in the area we were in, the focus had shifted, so it became a frontline area to essentially a rear area. There were parts of our battle group that were dealing with the Bosnians versus the Serbs, but where we were, it had been Croat versus Bosnian, and then it dried up. So what had happened in our area was overnight people could, and this is one of the things that actually happened later on, was that a mafia, there was for lack of a better term, it was a mafia. I think these were former secret policemen. And I think the structure of a secret police lends itself well to organized crime. So essentially, they were smuggling stuff between these front lines. A lot of consumer goods, heroin, liquor. And so all of a sudden, the fighting stops. So if people want something, they can go and buy it. They can just go up the street and buy it. Whereas 2 weeks ago, they would have been crossing a front line between two groups that were trying to kill each other. So the main destabilization force in the main group that was actually making things tough for all concerned in the last third of my time over there was the mafia, and they had the local police in their pocket as well. So
you said at the start of the interview that basically the Muslims were perhaps getting a bit of a free ride in the media.
Oh, for sure.
What was your sense? Were there any good guys in this story?
No, there weren't, because like I said, I mean, that British unit, like at the time, they've been amalgamated since to form part of the Rifles. They were the Royal Gloucester, Berkshire, and Wiltshire Regiment. So they've been amalgamated several times. Well, basically, like, you knew which area you were in by which churches or mosques were burnt. So if all the Catholic churches and basilica were burnt down, you were in a Muslim area. If all the mosques and cathedrals were burnt down, you were in a Serb area, that kind of thing. So. And judging by the people who constituted different groups of refugees that were passing through our area, I mean, I don't think anybody's hands were clean on this at all. I mean, there was one side that obviously the Serbs had kind of started things, but once the war progressed, I mean, they were very settling old scores. And I think that has to do with, the fact that, the nature of the former Yugoslavia being kind of forced together and held together by a strong man, and then he dies and the country splits apart. Not to mention there's a lot of ethnic animosity. Some people are still carrying on ethnic animosity that goes back to the Crusades, and as well, for a lot of people, the Second World War. So for example, there's a lot of people don't know this, but the Croats were their regime in the Second World War was collaborated with the Nazis. If memory serves, over 10,000 Croats were captured by the Soviets in Stalingrad, for example. So these groups found a new lease on life during their civil war, and we encountered lots of evidence of their activity. So there were different. We had intelligence briefings about who these guys were, what their insignia was. So like if they said that it was a quote unquote special forces unit, it was basically a death squad. So, and we were told to look for their insignia and report it as fast as we saw it. So, like I said, so we encountered those groups off and on as well. So,
Over the course of your tour, what kinds of changes are you seeing in the people around you, yourself, maybe personality-wise, or even tactically in the way you're doing things?
It's kind of extremes of both. Like in some cases it became more casual. In some cases you kind of really got sick and tired of people's idiosyncrasies in some ways too. So sometimes things would get forced to a head, sometimes they wouldn't. I think initially you're frightened and skittish, and then you kind of get used to things. So it's kind of hard to really enunciate what the changes were. I guess you just got used to kind of the way things were in certain areas, and you just, were able to deal with it. So initially, like if you heard explosions, it was kind of like, there would be a different reaction, and then it became like, well, they're not specifically targeting us, so it's not quite the same reaction.
And what about, you did get a chance to step outside of the theater and go to Hong Kong. What was that like, to make that transition midway through?
Well, actually, I was on the very first leave block, so it was kind of like I just kind of gotten used to it, and then about a month and change after we got there, that was my leave. So basically, I spent the last 4.5 months of the tour with no leave left. That was kind of tough, but Hong Kong at that time, 22 years old with, a full credit card, that was a lot of fun. I visited a unit that had been in Wainwright the year before, so I'd kept in contact with those guys too. They were one of the Gurkha battalions that was in Hong Kong. So it was kind of neat being shown around. You do the tourist thing, and then you get shown around by people that actually live there. It was a lot of fun. What I found was, since I was on leave with other, I guess, what amounted to other Army guys, it was all right. I wasn't off by myself for, except for afternoons here and there, because they were in the garrison and they were still working. But it wasn't like a shock or anything. I mean, it was just, as far as leaving a war zone and then going to a big city, it was more along the lines of, it's a big shock because I grew up in Edmonton and now I'm in Hong Kong. So it's that was more the shock than anything else.
But what kind of a shape are you in, physically, mentally, by the end of your 6 months, especially because you haven't had leave for 4 months?
I think by the time the tour was over, I was ready. It was kind of surreal. I was really kind of ready to get on with my life in a lot of ways. Like, I wasn't ready to leave the military per se, but it was kind of like, okay, I've had this experience, now what else is there? Plus, the Army at the time, it's like, put it this way, the last few years, I've had meals paid for me, when I've gone to a food court or something like that. That was not the case in late '94 with the breaking of all the revelations from the Somalia inquiry. So the military wasn't necessarily a happy place to be. At that time as well, when we got back, it was basically like, give us back your Kevlar, don't be a stranger. So like, it took me 3 days to clear into CFB Calgary. When we flew in, my parents were there to meet me, and there's another friend of mine from the regiment was there too, and so my parents are kind of like, well, it was late, so we were just giving a timing for the next day, and so my parents got a hotel, and my buddy and I shared a room in this hotel, and then we were there first thing in the morning back to our old company lines, and my father's like, well, how long are you going to be? And I said, I have no idea, but as soon as I can, as soon as I know, I'll come and tell you. And so like literally 10 minutes later, I'm kind of like, go, go, go. And Dad's like, are you sure? Yeah, go, 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 before they change their minds, and yeah, so that was surreal. I mean, as far as the end of the tour went, like I said, it was, obviously, if you had personality problems at the beginning of the tour, they're going to be worse by the end. But, and quite honestly, by the end of the tour, our job had changed enough. We were basically almost marooned at this checkpoint, monitoring traffic, for lack of a better term, for the last month and change that we were there. So that was a bit of a letdown compared to what we were up to before, but it was the job that was expected of us. So it was more boring at the end than it was at the beginning.
What about overall? How did the tour fulfill your expectations or your desires for what you wanted from it?
Well, I didn't really know what to expect, so I can't say it fulfilled anything. I mean, what I got out of it was, by just sheer happenstance, it was actually B Company of 1 PBCLI at that time was a very good unit. They kind of had the right mix of people being posted back from the airborne, and some very good people that just happened to be there. Our OC at the time was very, very focused on the welfare of his men. He had no problems with telling anybody what he thought, if he thought that his men were getting the short end of the stick. Our company sergeant major, by that time, had 30 years in the military, so I think he was on the verge of retirement. Like, this was on the last kick of the can. So I think with both of these guys, it would have been different if we'd maybe had somebody younger who was ambitious and afraid to tread on people's toes. We didn't have that with our company headquarters. Our other people at company headquarters were wired the right way. Like, we had, like I said, it was just the right group of people for the right time, and it was really something to have been in that. So that was the biggest thing I got, was that, in some ways it's like, as good as other units and subunits that I've worked with since then have been, it hasn't been like that. So that's one thing that I've missed. As far as other expectations, like, you just don't know what to expect. So there was stuff that I saw that was shocking, and there was other stuff that I was just bored to tears and wondering what I was doing there. But it was, in a lot of ways, I don't know what I would have done differently before that. So, like I said, it's hard to say what you're going to expect, or what you're going to expect when you didn't really know what you're going to encounter in the first place. So,
What's it like going from that tight-knit organization where life is pretty simple and focused to coming back to Alberta, making that transition?
Well, it was tough. I had like I mentioned before, it was in the middle of a hockey lockout, so hearing people complain about not being able to watch hockey, that's just their worldview. But I didn't expect people to understand what I had seen, but it just seemed so trivial, and so I mentioned something like that to a relative, and we nearly came to blows over it. And I'm glad it didn't, because I was definitely in the mood for a fight, and I probably would have overdone it. For almost a year after, I would catch myself checking door frames for booby traps when I go through a door, like, just subconsciously. Because of the mine threat it had been, we encountered, I would stay on the sidewalk and walk around on the sidewalk rather than cut across a field. And I remember picking up my fiancée. At the time, I was cutting through part of the University of Alberta, and I felt my heart rate going up, because basically all the buildings were intact and all the glass was in the windows. So I figured that we were going to get hit any second here, and I was kind of starting to move tactically, and just turned out that that's just Alberta in peacetime. But it was kind of took me a few weeks to decompress. And I had one incident downtown too, where I had grown up through school with a family that is from the former Yugoslavia. Like, they would be the Yugoslavs, or whoever would actually say they're mixed race, because one spouse was Serb and the other one was Muslim. But they had come to Canada, and that didn't really matter to them. But I met this kid at a bar, and he had a friend there, and he says, "Oh, Brendan, you just got back. This is so and so, and he's from over there too." And I said, "What part of Yugoslavia he's from?" And he said, "Former Yugoslavia." And I could pick up right away. I still don't react to belligerence very well, but I didn't really react to it very well back then. And so I knew right away, I knew by his accent which group which his ethnic group was, just by how he spoke English. And I asked, "Okay, so what part of the former Yugoslavia are you from?" And he told me, and I said, "Well, you know what, there's none of you left there anymore." And there actually wasn't. And so it just went downhill from there. So like I said, there was adjustment issues, but I guess I was pretty lucky. I mean, there's things that make me think about that. Like, I think the biggest trigger for me is there's some songs that come on the radio that make me think of that time. And quite honestly, if I smell, if I smell, decomposition or something like that, it takes me back, as well as quite actually diesel as well. Because when we're moving around, we're always in an M113. So if I smell diesel, it kind of diesel fumes, like in a concentrated manner, kind of makes me think of that time too. But the overwhelming majority of my memories are positive. I mean, what actually makes me the most sad is the fact that my fire team partner at the time is named Neal McKinnon, and he was killed in a training accident less than 6 months after we came back. So it's kind of like I have positive memories, but it makes me sad because, we lost Neal really close on to coming back. So.
Because he was killed in a field firing range.
Oh yes,
right?
Yes. Again, they threw training safety out the window and got somebody killed. Which pretty much always happened. It happened with Josh Baker as well in Afghanistan. So.
Was Neal McKinnon, was he an LER or was he?
No, he was a Patricia. He'd been rebadged the year before. I want to say from I'm not sure, it was the Cape Breton Highlanders. He was from Cape Breton.
Okay.
So, I credit him with saving my life twice. He, again, we're walking along and he saw a tripwire because of the way the light hit it. He saw a tripwire and I was standing right over it. So he basically called out stop and I pulled up short without stepping over this thing. And then later on in the tour, I mentioned before, we had a lot of mafia trying to destabilize us. Well, we always knew when one of these guys was around that something bad was going to happen. So we knew where he would go and drink every night. So I had this clever plan where I was going to wait for him and whack him, and Neal took 2 days to talk me out of it, basically. So with his argument was basically like, there's all sorts of unintended consequences, or you're going to go to hell with him. So basically, like I said, I credit with Neal saving my life twice. So most of the time I think about the back then, it's just that I wish Neal was still alive. So.
What, you said different songs will trigger something. Like, give me an example. What's a song that you associate with that time?
Well, there's just songs that were on the radio at the time. So, and again, we had little satellite radio receivers, so, from the BBC. So, Black Hole Sun by Soundgarden, I really like that. But, if I'm listening to it and I'm not in the correct mood, I have to turn it off, for example. Naveed by Our Lady Peace is another one. Like, these are just hits that were on the radio, that kind of thing. So what I ended up doing was just realizing that, they made me sad and they made me think of Neal, and I just realized that Neal wouldn't want me to, go around my life not enjoying it to the fullest. So I kind of had to force myself to start listening to this stuff again. So it's only been the last couple of years that I've been able to do that.
Did you have a desire for or seek out any kind of like counseling after you came home?
No, and quite honestly, part of that was because things got serious with my fiance, the girl that I'd been dating before the tour. We kind of fell in love in the mail, so to speak, because I would write her letters, and so things got serious with her. So I kind of had a reason to settle down and behave properly, or else I would have lost her. I mean, my plan when I came back was I was going to see how things went with this girl, or I had a friend that had joined a British Army unit and I was thinking of doing that. And I'd even thought about the French Foreign Legion briefly, but basically I was either going to see if the British Army would have me, or I probably would have head out to the West Coast to see about, just to see if the Hells Angels would let me hang around. But essentially things worked out with this girl, so here I am, 18 years of marriage and 2 kids later. So.
What do you think, if not specifically in your case, but the cases of your reserve peers, how they were treated when they came back from this tour?
Well, I think it took a while because the previous experience was Cyprus. So it was a different time and a different mission. So that was kind of the benchmark for a lot of stuff. There were still some Cyprus things that we had to kind of wean out of certain people when we were overseas initially, especially involving saluting things in that environment. But the problem was, like I said, with me, it's kind of like, literally 14 hours after I flew back, I'm on my own, and that's it. And I came back, and I had to go for a medical, and I had to get my claim processed. So I actually am on leave, and the reason I'm going and getting this stuff done is because, I had to take I was entitled to get reimbursed for putting my car in storage and a few other things. So I just wanted some money. And the way I got treated I have a leave pass, and I'm being told that I have to come back in DEUs because that was the dress of the day at CFB Edmonton at the time, because it was an Air Force base. And I came very close to being in front of the base RSM for how I bit back at some of the clerks, and I think we were kind of the first guys to come back, and they weren't dealing with people like us. And so, eventually they just processed us and got us out of the way instead of trying to deal with that. And I mean, this is kind of a gross thing to talk about, but because of where we were in, as part of my post-tour medical, I actually had to collect stool samples, believe it or not, because I guess some of the people that we relieved, they found that their vaccine packages weren't complete, so they were actually having typhus and cholera from some of the guys we relieved. And so I did what they told, and part of that was like no booze and no red meat. Well, I'm from Alberta, so no booze and no red meat for 3 days. I mean, forget it, right? And so I basically take these samples back in their little test tubes, and they're kind of like, oh, you didn't have to do that. And I said, well, you know what, you're taking them, because I'm not doing this again. Basically, I'm going to have a steak and a case of beer right now. So you guys are taking them, and you're not gonna phone me again, right? So it was kind of the funny things. But like I said, I mean, and as far as the units go, it's like, you're back, why aren't you parading? And I was actually very keen to get back and parade with the unit, because from walking around in the civilian side, they were the only people that really had, the only group of people that I could really relate to for a long time. And not that I held people in open contempt, but there's groups of people whose opinions matter, and that your opinion matters too. And that was basically the unit. The unit was, or the regiment at that time, was very important to me and still is.
How do you think, in hindsight, the whole experience affected you or changed you as a person, as a soldier? Well,
in general, it was, I guess, before my first son was born, it was probably the single most defining event in my life, I guess. Most of what my metric is not kind of before or after high school, but it's before or after I came back. As far as what it gave to me as a soldier was, if there's a certain part of your training where, back in Canada, where you have to suspend disbelief because, you're doing force on force, and with miles gear and other stuff. Like, for example, with miles gear, you can take cover behind drywall because it's laser, right? So, you wouldn't normally do that, but it kind of focused me on, on life or death stuff, like, because it can happen. I guess the other thing too is it kind of really diminished my tolerance for for stupidity, no matter what the rank, or what I perceived as stupidity. So I mean, that cost me for a while there, but I guess part of that was that that was a leadership style that I had in that company for a lot of that. So if nothing else, I owe it to those guys to kind of lead that way myself. So it's not that I had bad leaders back here, but they were really superlative there. So I've always kind of thought of those guys whenever I've been promoted or whenever I've been put in a leadership role. They were important to me. I hope I could measure up to them as time goes on.
You never you did the one tour, and then, as you said, Foreign Legion girlfriend. You went down the domestic route, the family route. Did you ever try to deploy again?
No, the times were just wrong. Like, the timing was wrong. Basically, I wasn't going to go back to Bosnia and be a gate guard. And quite honestly, after I came back, I went to NAIT and got a diploma in electrical engineering. So my wife is a pharmacist, so we're just happy just to make real money and spend it, I guess, for lack of anything else. I had opportunities to go overseas, but they coincided with my wife being pregnant with our 2 kids. So I wasn't about to just run off on the pregnant lady so I could relive my 20s, regardless of whether or not it would have been a pay cut to do so. I guess that's basically the timing of it. And yeah, so like I said, it's not like I'll never go again. It's just, I guess it's as much that I just, in some ways it's in the back of my head that, I probably will never work with as good a group of people like that again. So if anything, I'll probably be really picky about how I go over again or who I go with, as much as anything else. But like I said, it was just, the more recent stuff just happened to coincide with my wife being pregnant, and they were difficult. I mean, I had one child was born 5 weeks prematurely, for example. So I just didn't think it was a smart thing to do, basically, like, oh, we're having a baby, well, bye. That wouldn't have, it's one thing as a reservist, you can kind of pick and choose that kind of thing. So I wanted to be around for when my kids were born. So that was basically the decision cycle then. So.
How do you think these tours like yours changed the nature of the militia, now Army Reserve, here in Alberta?
I think it makes us more relevant, because for the first 5 or 6 years, so basically it wasn't until 95 or 96 that our courses were strictly interchangeable with regular force qualifications. Like there'd always be supplemental stuff that we would never do, and we'd always be short. So for example, my machine gun course, we didn't, even though I've trained in other turrets, I didn't have the Grizzly turret that was in the TP. So I'm not regular force machine gun qualified at the time, for example. So incrementally it made us more relevant, because we didn't have access to the same training that we have today. So it was a way to keep us relevant. It was a way to give us access to training. So in general, it brought the quality of the reserves in this area up, just because so many of us went on tour, and we got to experience some training at a bit of a higher level than we normally would.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you want to finish on?
No, not really, I guess. I mean, it's kind of weird talking about some of the stuff after that. I don't think about this as often as I normally do, but it is what it is. So,
what kind of advice do you give, now that you're a sergeant, what kind of advice do you give the young soldiers that join the regiment here about sort of the paths that they might take in their careers?
Well, I tell the young guys that if they have an opportunity now, take it, because once they're married, kids, job, mortgage, they're not going to have that flexibility. So if something crops up and all they're doing is basically, leaving a relatively low-paying job without a lot of prospects, or if they can take a break from school, then take it, regardless of whether or not it's a call out or courses or tours and things like that. I always tell them that just keep an eye on the people leading you as well. I mean, not all of them are going to be good. Most of them are, and just make sure, and just, pay attention to what's being taught and try to read between the lines as well. But no, like I said, I always advise people to take advantage of opportunities that they have, because, a lot of ways I didn't have those. Initially it was the tours were basically, it was that or nothing for a long time for opportunities. So I did that.
It just occurred to me that, just thinking about Afghanistan, your regiment took some casualties.
Yes, I was the 2IC of Ray Arndt's firing party, and I commanded the pallbearers for Zach McCormick and Josh Baker.
So what was that like in terms of, for the regiment and for you?
It was the best and worst time for both, in both cases, because it's devastating, especially Ray. He was very, very popular. He and I did a lot of training together. We're fairly close. And losing him, especially with less than a month left in his tour, was very tough. But like I said, the part is that when the regimental why we need a regimental system, for example, is when the extended regimental family comes together to support each other, and to make sure that, as well as the ceremonial side, to make sure that we do the right thing by their families and everything else when they come back. I mean, that's important too. So again, it was tough losing a friend, For McCormick and Baker, I was been more of a basically they both worked for me in the month or two before they left. I was a platoon warrant on a support weapons course we were running out of our lines, and so like I said, they weren't my peer, but I knew of them and I had trained them. So I mean, with McCormick's death, that's combat, and it was tough. And the hardest part about that was I had only been a father for let's see, my son had been born in. It was only about 14 months. So when you're at a funeral and they start showing the pictures of, the boy at different ages as he grows into a man, and I see him at his age that my son was at the time, that was tough for me. So basically, and I put up a lot of, I was the pallbearer commander, so I basically the one guy in the whole parade that had to have his shit completely wired tight. And so I probably put myself under a lot of pressure as well, but that was the one time I actually did that tactical breathing that Grossman talks about, because I had to keep it together after that, to get the casket out of the building and into the hearse for the graveside. So that was tough. Baker, that was really tough too. We had 3 regimental funerals in 8 weeks that year. So the third one was Matthew Radowitz, who'd been killed in a car accident. But losing Baker was really rough as well. He was very popular. Really good sense of humor that transcended rank levels and stuff, and he was really quick. The only thing I could ever get him on is because he's from Toronto, so it's just oh yeah, well your hometown sports teams suck, and then kind of impose rank and then try and leave the room with dignity, because I couldn't keep up with this guy's wit at all. And of course, later turns into outrage at the fact that it was negligence that killed him, and the individual in question basically lawyered up and threw everybody else under the bus. But like I said, it didn't change what we had to do. We flew out to Scarborough, where his family plot was, and did the right thing by his family. It was the same guys that I commanded with McCormick. And the firing party was provided by the Queen's Own Rifles in that situation in Scarborough. So we did really well as for the job that we had to do. But like I said, it's tough losing guys, but it does focus you. So like I said, it's bad losing guys, but the good news is we have a regimental system that we can fall back on and use when things get really tough like that. So that was my experience from that era, was having to deal with that.
It's interesting what you say. It resonates with me. Once you're a father, it's like you cross some kind of a line.
Yeah.
In terms of how you...
It's kind of like before and after the Copernican theory, right? Where it's the sun no longer revolves around you. Right?
I'm glad you explained that.
Yeah.
But maybe, yeah. Anything else you want to add?
No, I think that's it. I'll probably think of something on the way home when it's too late, but that's probably it.
Thanks very much.
No problem, sir.